and welcome everyone. Glad that you signed up for another series in public theology at Drumalis. We are looking this time at living with Imperial Legacies. And we begin this evening at the beginning, in a sense, looking at how empire is born or was born. The Acadian Empire, the very first empire in human history. Just to quickly run through the program, next week we look at living in the shadow of empire, and we follow the story of the ancient Jewish people from the imperial power of Egypt through to Imperial Rome in the 1st century CE. Europe rules the world. Then on week 3, we look at modern imperial domination. And then there is a break every 3rd or 4th week. We come back on the 1st of February to look at the British Empire, global power and imperial angst. On the 8th of February, we look at Ireland and the British Empire. That is a whole story in itself. And then the European Christian slave trade from 1441 to 1888. On the 1st of March, owning institutionalized racism and white supremacy. And then the last 2 sessions on the 8th of March, living with imperial legacies, how they still around and still impact our lives. And finally, on the 15th of March, religion and empire. So empire is born, this evening's focus, and we will have the usual opportunities to share with each other in group discussion, interactive discussion, and hopefully a learning experience with and from each other. But why explore a history of empires and slavery and colonialism? Well, we do so because the legacies seem to be everywhere, and we all live in some way with an imperial inheritance. We also explore such history because we're now at a point where we are moving into something of an unknown future, a time of huge global and geopolitical shifts. The world is changing, and as we navigate the unknown future, our maps and our coordinates have been set by history, and globally that history is imperial. In one author's words, it is better accepted and understood than downplayed or simply undetected. I suppose the history of empires has been downplayed, certainly in educational terms, untaught, largely or leading to a largely undetected narrative. Russians, for example, tell a narrative of how they fought the fascists in World War II, but they downplay, if not ignore, Stalin's purges and horrendous murders. The centenary of the October 1917 revolution was really downplayed in Russia. Then a British narrative will say a lot about British heroics in World War II, but say nothing about the power and cruelty and brutality of the British Empire. The narrative of empires tells a benign story, but never really the parallel story of resistance and often, if not always, a very brutal response to resistance. And it is this latter narrative that is beginning now to emerge as we struggle with imperial legacies and try to navigate an unknown future. It was the Monty Python series that asked the question, what did the Romans do for us? Well, they were invoking Rome, the model or the template for modern empires. But there is a much more serious question now being asked by those who have lived under a plethora of modern imperial powers. What did the Romans do to us? Indians ask, what did the British do to us? The Vietnamese ask, what did the French do to us? The Indonesians, what did the Dutch do to us? And for these and many other peoples who experienced colonization and imperial presence, the answer is much brutality, violence, and killing, in many cases thousands and even millions of lives. And with good reason, we live now in an era of counter-narratives that subvert the benign narratives that empires like to tell about themselves. And so in our time, a more complex set of narratives is emerging, more balanced, more truthful, historical narratives. In many ways, we're all post-imperial people, shaped by an imperial world, now having to navigate an unknown future, which will probably be different from the past. And therefore, we need an understanding, a consciousness of imperial histories, and not just from the empire's perspective, inextricably bound up with imperialism and our modern histories of it, are slavery and colonialism. So the future is demanding that we are aware and understand the legacies and inheritance in which we stand. Well, we need to begin a long way back, because we've lived with empire, it seems, for quite some time. We tend to think, I suppose, that we have always been here on the planet as humans, but our ancestors were as recent as 2.5 million years ago. Homo sapiens, that is really us, a mere 200,000 years ago. We live on a 4.5 billion year old planet Earth. But for an exceedingly small segment of time, in a 200,000 year human time frame, we have lived with empire from only 4,250 years ago. So having started extremely late with empire, we have lived with imperial power since then. Having built an empire from scratch, not having a template, humankind appears to have liked the idea and has been using the template since to create domination systems, conquer and control subject peoples, and extract huge amounts of wealth from the colonized. And military might has been essential to empire building, usually very violent when the empire has been, especially when the empire has been resisted. And religion of varying kinds has been integral to empire. No empire has been without an imperial theology to give it ultimate and absolute authority, authorization, and legitimacy. And all of this was put together by a human called Sargon 4,500 years ago. And we still live with the Imperial Legacies. In a sense, it is very difficult to really be post-imperial. I suppose it all started from the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. An ice age began to retreat. We moved through to a time where there was a very stabilized environment. Humankind began to move away from gathering plants and hunting animals, began to farm. Humans stopped wandering around and they settled down, domesticating animals, planting crops. Now this rather remarkably happened in 11 different regions around the world, each farming development independent of each other and one innovation leading to another. And it all led to building grain stores, herding, digging irrigation channels, tilling and planting, adding manure. So agriculture had arrived. This revolution, humans were collaborating. In a sense, civilization had begun. Farmers had surplus, and so markets developed. Bartering began. Food and other assets were exchanged. People with skills in wood and stone were needed. Trades increased and markets developed into towns located in fertile places. Towns became cities, city-states. Farmers looked for fresh fields. Civilization was expanding. Life was changing into increasingly complex societies. The agricultural revolution was a revolution introducing ownership and power. Who controlled what, and how much power and goods were possible. The birth of an empire was getting closer. So civilization was born. A few years ago, I was in Turkey on research purposes, and accompanied by a Turkish friend, I visited the Turkish city of Urfa, remarkably close, only 4 or 5 miles away from the Syrian border. The director of the Urfa Museum brought us to an archaeological site some distance from the city. The landscape was barren and wild and in the middle of what to me seemed to be nowhere. And there was this large excavation, still in progress. From a raised viewing platform, we looked at a stunning sight and sight. The excavation had begun in 1995. And we were looking at what is known as Göbekli Tepe. No evidence of human settlement or houses had been found. What was found were monumental pillars decorated with spectacular engravings. Each stone pillar weighed up to 7 tons and was 5 meters in height. And close by, a half-chiseled pillar weighing 50 tons. Was found. Now, as an Irish person, I was proud of Newgrange in the Boyne Valley, older than the pyramids, we like to tell ourselves, and dated around 3,200 BCE. And I'd been to Stonehenge in England a mere 2,500 BCE. But at Göbekli Tepe, I was looking at a monumental stone structure, possibly a temple or a series of temples, dated 9,500 BCE. It left one breathless, stunned, not just by the timescale, but by the enormity and the beauty of the structure and the engravings. This was the very cradle of human civilization. And standing awestruck at Göbekli Tepe was a profoundly spiritual experience, mystical, a moment of transcendence. Now, the people who constructed this were not farmers, but foragers with capabilities and a complexity of culture that was mind-blowing. Why did they build such a monumental structure? Now, temples may be speculation, but all we can guess is that they built for some mysterious cultural or religious purpose. And what makes Göbekli Tepe fascinating is that we expect people to build a village, a human settlement, and then build a temple. And here it seems the temple was built first. And if there was a village, it was built later. So the agricultural revolution had begun around 12,000 BCE, some 2,500 years before Göbekli Tepe was built. The foragers were becoming farmers, and farmers were beginning to settle. Villages and settlements were being built. As J.M. Roberts in his new Penguin History of the World has said, from that background emerges the first true urbanism, that of a place called Sumer, and the first observable civilization. Sumer is in southern Mesopotamia, and the population may have arrived there around 4000 BCE. And the Sumerians may have been a mixture of races. They too had temples, they invented writing, and they have left us lists of goods and receipts and notebooks and ledgers, and much of it with a very strong economic emphasis. So this is an established civilization after 3000 BCE. And it is from this urbanized civilization that the oldest story in the world emerges, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which includes a story of a destructive flood. Much later, the Hebrew people borrowed and adapted this story, and is better known to us as the Bible story of Noah's Ark. Summer urban development produced cities and dynasties. Some of these cities even had a democratic basis. All this saw kings, priests, and warlords emerge with standing armies. The city-state had to be defended from others who wanted to expand their territory and wealth. And everybody went into expansionist mode. And summer's first civilizational phase lasted from 3,360 to 2,400 BCE. And from among these kings and priests and warlords, a great individual leader emerged, and with him, the first empire. We'll come back to Sargon a little later, but now an opportunity perhaps to go into rooms as we describe them in Zoom, and Loretta will guide us through that process. And there are a couple of questions that might help discussion. One we began with, why explore a history of empires and slavery and colonialism? And maybe have some discussion also about the importance of the agricultural revolution for the human organization of life. So enjoy about 20 minutes of conversation together. Okay, I take it we're all back, and we'll take a closer look at the person himself, Sargon, who was the leader, if you like, or the emperor, or the guy who led and created this first empire, and in many ways set a template for what was to follow. Sargon I, he was king of the city of Akkad, and he conquered Mesopotamia in 2334 BCE. And that began Acadian supremacy. He sent his army as far as Egypt and Ethiopia. Now, the Sumerian city-states probably had populations of 20 to 30,000 each, and it was out of this creative and innovative civilization that the Acadian empire grew. Now, the name Sargon means the true king, probably a self-designation. Emperors like that kind of thing, it seems. But his birth story, invented again by himself, perhaps as emperors create their own myths, has Sargon set on the river in a basket of rushes. Now, that sounds familiar in a much later story of a baby Moses told a millennium later. And we're dealing perhaps here with an archetypal kind of myth. But Sargon grew up with a destiny, and that was to overthrow and conquer Sumerian cities, including Ur and probably Babylon. Paul Strathern, an historian of empire, says that after every victory, he tore down the city walls, and the city was incorporated into the Acadian empire. In conquered Babylon, he built his palace, set up the imperial administrative headquarters, and established his center of military power. And from Babylon, he continued his expansionist campaigns and extended his empire across the then known world. Now, Sargon had a very well-run military machine. Later stories told of Sargon having neither rival nor equal, setting up Acadian law wherever he conquered, and using barges to transport the booty and the wealth from elsewhere back to the imperial city. He built a whole series of canals. And it was not just making travel possible, like railways in India, but also like railways in India, it was the means by which wealth could be extracted and moved towards the center. His court is said to have numbered 5,400 men. There you have the imperial civil service. And like every emperor or leader of empire who followed, Sargon had grand ideas about himself, publicly declaring, "Now, any king who wants to call himself my equal, wherever I went, let him go." Sargon ruled over his empire for 55 years, 2334 to 2279 BCE. However, this very first empire met enormous resistance. There were eventually revolts to which he responded with fury and brutal violence. And in the latter years of his life, revolts became a much more regular occurrence. Sargon was succeeded eventually by his son Rimush, who faced further revolts. And after ruling as emperor for 9 years, Rimush was killed by his civil servants. So the empire continued, and so did the resistance. And domination and resistance were to continue in history as a feature of empire. Sargon, remember, had no imperial template to follow. He set the template for imperial rule. The Acadian language was imposed on those conquered, and the vassal city-states paid taxes to keep the imperial administration in place and to maintain the Acadian garrisons. Domination was further maintained by the royal monopoly on foreign trade, as well as the awarding of estates in conquered territory to what is best described as the Acadian aristocracy. Sargon even invented a calendar, which was used right throughout the empire, all part of imperial uniformity. He also standardized weights and measures. Perhaps thereafter they were known as imperial weights and measures, but they remained the standard for over 1,000 years. The Acadian Empire erected huge monuments and great buildings. The latter were known as ziggurats, which contained shrines at the top, where only the priests could enter. The ultimate reinforcement of power was when the emperor claimed for himself divine status. The imperial ruler assumed deity in the image of the god or descending from the divine members of the family. If you were in the emperor's god presence, you trembled, and there was no getting away from his wrath, even in the next life. Who dared to question the emperor, the great leader? And so we might say that the divine right of kings was born, as was Acadian exceptionalism. Sargon had ultimate and absolute authority, and all resistance was treasonous and against God's anointed. Maybe for God and empire was the Acadian motto. Not surprisingly, the Acadians were to impose their gods on the conquered cities. So empire was born, and empire was to last, or was to repeat itself, and has repeated itself throughout the rest of history. The Acadian Empire lasted no more than 2 centuries, from 2344 to 2154 BCE. The imperial template had been created. Sargon and the imperial power had to make it, they'd had to make it up as they went along. But the Acadian stamp can be found in every imperial power that followed. Empires are domination systems built with military might, as well as imposing social and cultural norms. They are economies of extraction or predatory economies. And they all claim divine legitimacy, divine right, and exceptional status. And who dares to resist them? And yet the template of empire includes the template of resistance. The template also includes brutal violence and huge loss of life. in response often to that resistance. Empire has been described in terms of 3 Gs: gold, guns, and God. It's a recurring pattern, and in the next number of weeks we will find ourselves returning to it again and again. But before we have more conversation, let me add a brief postscript to this. The Acadian Empire eventually collapsed, but it was not the end of summer. By the end of Sargon's time, a true state was in existence. Roberts, in his History of the World, puts it this way: the Acadian hegemony was relatively short. After 200 years under Sargon's great-grandson, it was overthrown, apparently by mountain peoples called Gutens, and the last of summer, called Neo-Sumerian by scholars, began. For another 200 years or so, until 2000 BCE, hegemony again passed to the native Sumerians. And one of its great kings was Hammurabi. And his reputation is as a lawgiver. And the Hammurabi Code is the oldest statement of legal principle of an eye for an eye. The code was written in Acadian around 1754 BCE, and it contains 282 laws, which can be described as humane and rooted very much in justice. A little over 1,000 years later, the Hammurabi Code was to influence the Hebrew people as they drew up their social and political ethics and created their code of justice and ethical practice. The way of justice and life, this is what we find in the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrews were not a powerful people, but their community life, influenced by the Hammurabi Code, was to be lived constantly in the shadow of empire. They lived until the Common Era, dominated by successive empires, and developed not a military, but a profound ethic of resistance. And it is their story, in the shadow of empire, that we come to next Tuesday evening. But meantime, let's have open conversation for a moment. What would you describe as the characteristics of the Acadian Empire? And we'll come to another question and ask, why was resistance such an integral part of empire from the very beginning? So how would we describe, as we sense it, the characteristics of the Acadian Empire? And does that help in any way to come back to a question one of our groups posed in the first session? What is empire? Does that help maybe to looking at the Acadian experience to realize what this template of empire is and how it has worked itself out in the rest of history?